Early morning, February 2011, South Los Angeles woke up to helicopters circling low over Vernon Avenue, while unmarked vans rolled quietly through blocks folks already knew were hot. Federal agents from the DEA, ATF, and IRS task forces kicked in doors across Central Avenue, sweeping up names most outsiders never heard, but locals whispered about for decades. Radios crackled with talk of kilos, rifles, stacks of cash, yet what really stood out was how old some targets sounded when detectives read their files. This was not some new crew blowing up overnight, since many of those names traced back nearly a century. That question lingered heavy in the air, so to understand why that raid even happened, you gotta rewind far past wiretaps, way back before helicopters ever hovered over South Central. Long before Los Angeles became a sprawl of freeways, the stretch near Vernon looked like an industrial corridor built on steel mills, rail yards, slaughterhouses, and factories pulling in migrant labor from northern Mexico. By the early 1920s, families settled between Alameda Street and Santa Fe Avenue, working jobs at places like Farmer John's meatpacking plants or the sprawling Studebaker facilities. Those neighborhoods carried tension since Mexican immigrants faced hostility from police units, white youth clubs, local business patrols guarding turf. Out of that pressure, young men started forming tight cliques simply to move through their own streets without constant harassment. One of those circles gathered around 38th Street, a small east-west strip sitting right between Vernon industry lines and the Los Angeles riverbanks. Those early kids were not organized criminals at first, since most were sons of railroad workers or factory hands just trying to hold dignity inside a rough environment. Still, identity mattered heavy during that era, especially once the Pachuco style started taking hold across East Los Angeles. Young dudes rocked draped zoot suits, wide hats, watch chains hanging low, pulling inspiration from jazz culture mixed with borderland pride. Historians later traced that aesthetic directly into early 38th Street circles, noting how fashion became armor in neighborhoods where respect decided survival. Older residents from the area recalled teenagers gathering outside pool halls near Central Avenue, forming bonds through music, slang, shared struggle, rather than organized crime. As Los Angeles expanded through the late 1920s, small hustles naturally crept into those social circles, since poverty pushed teenagers toward quick money whenever opportunities showed up. Police reports from that decade mention auto theft rings popping up near Vernon rail lines, along with backyard gambling houses tucked behind butcher shops. When prohibition still shaped underground economies, bootlegging moved through those same industrial corridors, letting local youths play lookout roles for older operators. By the time alcohol bans ended in 1933, many street crews had already tasted easy profit, making it harder to walk away clean. That shift nudged some 38th Street youngsters into petty rackets, even though they still looked more like neighborhood kids than hardened gangsters. Around that same period, symbols started forming quietly, building identity layers that later generations would carry heavily across decades. Oral histories collected from Eastside elders describe early hand signals, coded nicknames, tattoo markings etched with sewing needles rather than proper machines. Those markings often included simple numbers or initials tied to blocks rather than large gang logos, showing how localized the identity still felt. Neighborhood stories even mention older members teaching new recruits how to navigate alley routes, mapping safe paths across railroad crossings after sunset. None of that looked like a criminal empire yet, but the blueprint for tight loyalty was already there. Rumors also began swirling during the late 1930s, giving the clique an early reputation larger than its actual size. Some tales claim members carried razor blades tucked under sleeves, while others spoke about knives hidden inside hats during late-night dances. No official records ever confirmed those details, yet the stories traveled fast through South Central, shaping how outsiders viewed the group. Police logs from the era started labeling certain youths as Pachucos, linked to 38th Street, tying style directly to suspicion. That labeling mattered, since once authorities wrote a name into reports, it tended to stick across generations. By the end of the 1930s, the 38th Street clique had not become a full-scale criminal organization, though its presence was already felt across Vernon blocks. Arrest sheets listed assaults, robberies, and illegal card games tied loosely to youths, carrying that neighborhood identity. At the same time, community elders remembered some members protecting local families during late-night conflicts, adding complexity to their image. That dual perception built a foundation where fear mixed with admiration, creating a myth long before headlines ever caught up. Those early decades planted the seed, setting up a name that would travel far beyond one small street once history started paying attention. Everything shifted during the summer of 1942 when a night near a spot locals called Sleepy Lagoon pulled the 38th Street name into national headlines. That place sat close to Bell Gardens, a dusty watering hole where teenagers gathered for parties far from heavy police presence. On August 2, 1942, a young Mexican-American named Jose Gallardo Diaz was found badly beaten after one of those gatherings. He died shortly afterward at Los Angeles County Hospital, leaving investigators scrambling for answers without solid evidence. Police moved fast, rounding up dozens of Mexican youths, many of them loosely tied to the 38th Street Circle. Within days, headlines across the Los Angeles Times and local dailies started framing the death as proof of a violent Mexican gang problem spreading through the city. Officers arrested 24 young men, while prosecutors built a case labeling them members of the 38th Street Gang regardless of actual affiliation. Some defendants barely knew each other, yet authorities bundled them together into a single narrative of organized brutality. The courtroom setup felt stacked from the start, since defendants were seated away from their lawyers, limiting communication throughout proceedings. That arrangement already hinted that the trial would carry more spectacle than fairness. What followed only deepened the imbalance, as prosecutors leaned heavily on cultural stereotypes rather than forensic proof. One so-called expert testified that Mexican youths carried a biological tendency toward violence, language that stunned even some observers at the time. Judges allowed defendants to remain in zoot suits during trial, turning fashion into visual evidence of guilt before jurors. Photographs of draped coats and chain watches circulated widely, feeding public fear around Pachuco culture. Instead of separating style from crime, the court fused both into one dangerous image. By early 1943, verdicts landed heavy despite weak physical evidence connecting defendants directly to the killing. 3 men received first-degree murder convictions, while others faced lesser charges that still carried long sentences. Families packed courtrooms, watching sons led away in chains as reporters framed the moment like a victory over gang violence. Civil rights advocates, including journalist Carrie McWilliams and activist Luisa Moreno, began questioning the entire process publicly. They pointed out contradictions in testimony, highlighting how little concrete proof existed tying the youths to Diaz's death. While appeals slowly worked through the system, the convicted men served time in San Quentin and other state facilities. Inside prison walls, something unexpected happened that would echo far beyond those cells. Instead of fading into obscurity, the defendants became symbols for Mexican-American resistance across Southern California. Community members formed the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee, raising funds and organizing rallies demanding fair treatment. That movement pulled artists, union organizers, and even Hollywood figures like Orson Welles into the conversation. Then, in October 1944, the California Court of Appeals overturned the convictions, citing insufficient evidence along with clear procedural bias. Judges ruled the original trial carried prejudice that denied defendants a fair hearing, effectively collapsing the entire prosecution. When the young men finally stepped out of prison, they did not return quietly into old neighborhoods. Crowds greeted them like returning soldiers, cheering outside East Los Angeles streets where tension still lingered. That reception transformed a legal reversal into a cultural turning point. By then, wartime hysteria had already spilled into the streets, fueling the 1943 Zoot Suit riots that further complicated everything. Sailors stationed in Los Angeles clashed with Mexican-American youths downtown, stripping Zoot Suits off teenagers during violent rampages. Newspapers again framed Pachucos as threats, linking them back to the Sleepy Lagoon defendants regardless of court outcomes. That chaos hardened identities on both sides, making style feel like a badge of defiance rather than simple fashion. Young Mexican Americans started viewing the acquitted defendants as proof that survival required unity. For the 38th Street clique, the impact ran deeper than simple notoriety, since the case embedded their name into historical memory. Older members later described how younger recruits referenced Sleepy Lagoon stories like inherited folklore passed through generations. That narrative reshaped how identity functioned inside the neighborhood, shifting from local pride into something larger tied to resistance. Instead of being just another street clique, the name began carrying weight across broader Chicano consciousness. That psychological shift mattered, since myths tend to last longer than court transcripts. Even decades later, historians trace a direct line between Sleepy Lagoon and the evolution of Mexican-American gang culture across Los Angeles. The case gave 38th Street a legend status long before drug markets or prison alliances defined its reputation. Stories of wrongful convictions mixed with tales of toughness, blending victimhood and defiance into one identity. That blend fueled a mindset where survival, loyalty, and image intertwined tightly across generations. Once that seed took root, the clique stopped being just a neighborhood story and started becoming something history would never fully forget. The Sleepy Lagoon reversal did not calm tensions across Los Angeles, since the city was already boiling during wartime transitions. In June 1943, months before the appeals decision, clashes exploded into what became known as the Zoot Suit riots. U.S. Navy sailors flooded downtown streets, targeting Mexican-American youths wearing draped suits tied to Pachuco culture. Those attacks stretched from Main Street into East Los Angeles neighborhoods, pulling civilians into days of chaotic violence. Police often arrested the victims instead of the attackers, reinforcing a message many youths already understood clearly. That moment reshaped identity inside circles like 38th Street, pushing style into something deeper than clothing choices. Zoot suits stopped being fashion statements, turning into visible declarations of survival inside a hostile environment. Young men who watched those riots unfold carried the memory into adulthood, shaping how they viewed authority moving forward. Community elders later described that period as the turning point when distrust hardened permanently. Instead of blending back into normal life, many youths leaned further into tight neighborhood loyalty. After World War II ended, demographic shifts transformed South Los Angeles faster than any courtroom ruling ever could. Thousands of African-American families migrated west during the Great Migration, seeking industrial work tied to defense factories. At the same time, Mexican-American populations expanded through both birth rates and continued immigration from northern Mexico. Housing covenants limited where minorities could live, packing communities tightly into areas around Central Avenue and Vernon corridors. That density intensified territorial awareness, making every block feel like contested ground. Inside that environment, small street groups started evolving into more structured operations, including the early forms of 38th Street leadership. Veterans returning from wartime service brought new discipline, applying military hierarchy concepts to neighborhood organization. Older members began guiding younger recruits more deliberately, establishing roles beyond loose social circles. Some handled street presence, while others coordinated hustles tied to gambling or protection rackets. This shift marked the first time the clique showed signs of internal structure rather than scattered alliances. By the early 1950s, police reports started mentioning emerging figures, described as shot callers, within Mexican-American neighborhoods. These were individuals who mediated disputes, directed retaliation, or negotiated with rival groups across nearby blocks. Names rarely appeared in public archives, though oral histories reference older figures who carried influence beyond their immediate streets. Their authority did not rely on formal titles, since respect often came from a reputation built through survival and street credibility. That informal hierarchy laid the groundwork for organized leadership that later generations would clearly recognize. Economic changes also pushed members toward more coordinated hustles during the 1950s, especially as factory jobs fluctuated across industrial zones. Some residents recalled backroom card games operating near Vernon Avenue bars, pulling steady cash into small networks. Others spoke about early extortion patterns targeting local vendors who wanted protection from rival youths. Though still small scale, those activities hinted at broader ambitions forming quietly within the group. Each hustle added another layer to a reputation already shaped by earlier myths. Stories from that era also mention rumors of cross-border connections forming long before federal agencies noticed organized trafficking routes. Truck drivers moving produce between Baja California and Los Angeles sometimes doubled as couriers for contraband items. Oral accounts suggest a few 38th Street associates learned how to stash goods inside shipment compartments. No formal indictments confirmed those claims, though the rumors persisted through multiple generations. Whether fully accurate or not, the stories reflected growing ambitions stretching beyond neighborhood limits. During the late 1950s into early 1960s, small clusters of members began drifting into other states following job opportunities. Some relocated to places like Chicago or Utah, carrying their street identity along with them quietly. These moves did not resemble organized expansion yet, since they followed migration patterns rather than strategic planning. Still, those early relocations planted seeds for future satellite cliques decades later. Each departure carried neighborhood culture into new cities, spreading influence without headlines. Back home, the gang's image continued developing into something layered and complicated across local communities. Shop owners feared certain members who demanded free goods or subtle payments for safety. At the same time, residents recalled instances where older figures intervened during disputes, stopping violence from spilling onto innocent families. That dual perception built a reputation balancing menace with occasional protection, making outsiders wary while insiders navigated mixed feelings. The contradiction helped the name endure, since complexity often fuels longevity more than simple fear. By the early 1960s, 38th Street had shifted from myth-fueled notoriety into a structured neighborhood presence with deeper roots. The group still lacked massive criminal enterprises seen later, though its foundation had clearly hardened. Leadership patterns existed, migration trails were forming, and organized hustles were slowly emerging. Those quiet developments rarely made newspapers, yet they shaped the future far more than public legends. Underneath the surface, groundwork was already laid for a network that would eventually stretch well beyond one Los Angeles street. By the early 1970s, the streets around Vernon and Central started shifting again, though this time the change came from money flowing through narcotics rather than migration patterns. Los Angeles was becoming a major hub for heroin moving north from Mexico, and neighborhoods near industrial corridors sat directly along those routes. Law enforcement later traced multiple distribution lines running through South Central blocks, placing areas like 38th Street right in the middle. Small-time hustles that once relied on gambling or minor rackets suddenly looked outdated next to the profits narcotics could generate. That shift pulled many neighborhood crews deeper into a world far more structured and far more dangerous. As heroin spread through Los Angeles during the mid-1970s, open-air dealing zones began forming near intersections tied to long-standing street identities. Residents described corners where buyers from outside neighborhoods lined up after dark, creating steady traffic late into the night. Police patrol notes from that era mentioned increased arrests around Central Avenue corridors, including areas tied loosely to 38th Street activity. Those markets changed daily life for locals, turning familiar blocks into constant watch zones. Money started moving faster than before, pulling younger recruits into cycles older members struggled to control. City officials responded with unusual tactics once the volume of narcotics activity became impossible to ignore. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, some streets near known dealing areas were partially blocked to discourage outside buyers. Barriers went up around certain industrial corridors, creating choke points meant to disrupt traffic patterns feeding drug markets. Reports from community meetings described frustration among residents who felt trapped between addiction waves and heavy police presence. Even with those measures, trade continued flowing, proving how deeply the market had taken root. As profits climbed, firepower escalated across South Central neighborhoods during the same period. Members who once carried small pistols began acquiring shotguns, automatic rifles, and modified weapons with erased serial numbers. Stash houses became common, used for storing narcotics, firearms, and cash within residential blocks. Investigators later noted how some homes functioned as rotating depots, switching occupants frequently to avoid detection. That level of organization marked a clear break from earlier decades, when operations felt more scattered. While street economies expanded, a parallel shift was happening inside California's prison system, where alliances formed that would reshape the gang landscape permanently. During the 1970s, the Mexican Mafia, known inside facilities as La M, began consolidating influence over Southern California street groups. Inmates tied to older Mexican-American neighborhoods, including figures connected to 38th Street roots, earned reputations for toughness behind bars. Prison politics demanded loyalty, and alliances formed along regional lines rather than individual blocks. Those connections created a pipeline linking street activity directly to the prison authority. By the late 1970s, that prison power started shaping identities outside as well, pushing many Southern California gangs toward a shared Surino label. The number 13 became symbolic, referencing the letter M as a nod to Mexican Mafia influence. For groups like 38th Street, adopting that identity meant aligning with a larger network rather than operating independently. The shift brought benefits such as protection inside prison walls, though it also came with strict expectations. Once tied to La M, independence started fading quickly. That connection introduced a new economic model built on taxation rather than loose hustles. Street dealers operating within certain neighborhoods were expected to pay a percentage upward, feeding money into prison-controlled systems. Failure to pay could trigger violent consequences ordered from inside correctional facilities. Court documents from later decades would confirm that this taxation model started forming during this period. It transformed gangs into revenue streams tied directly to incarcerated leadership. Communication methods also evolved, allowing prison figures to influence street operations without stepping outside cell blocks. Messages traveled through coded letters known as kites, carried by visitors or smuggled through legal mail. Some former inmates later described how directives about retaliation or alliances spread quietly through those channels. Orders could travel from Pelican Bay or San Quentin into South Central streets within days. That invisible chain of command added a new layer of discipline across multiple neighborhoods. By the early 1980s, discipline tightened across groups operating under that umbrella, including circles connected to 38th Street. Members understood that individual actions could trigger consequences reaching beyond their own blocks. Street conflicts now carried implications inside prisons, creating feedback loops that few earlier generations experienced. Loyalty stopped being local, shifting toward a broader system linking cities, facilities, and networks. That structure gave the gang world a level of organization rarely seen before. As that era closed, the transformation was already clear, even if headlines had not fully caught up yet. What began decades earlier as a neighborhood clique rooted in identity had evolved into a participant within a larger criminal economy. Drug money, prison alliances, and taxation systems reshaped priorities across South Los Angeles. Younger members inherited a structure far more complex than the loose circles of earlier years. Without many realizing it at the time, the blueprint for modern gang economics had already been locked into place. As the 1980s rolled deeper into the early 1990s, the money flowing through narcotics did not just change economics. It sharpened rivalries across South Central blocks. Territories that once held loose borders turned into rigid lines nobody crossed without consequences. Groups tied to different identities began clashing more openly, especially between Mexican-American crews and African-American sets already rooted in nearby neighborhoods. Police logs from that period mention repeated confrontations around Florence, Firestone, and Vernon corridors. Those conflicts were no longer isolated disputes, since entire blocks started aligning with broader alliances. Among those rivalries, tension with blood-affiliated groups surfaced repeatedly during the late 1980s street reports. Feuds with sets like the Pueblo Bishop Bloods or Bloodstone Villains developed over control of corners linked to drug traffic. Shootings escalated during nighttime hours, often tied to retaliation cycles that stretched weeks or months. Community members recalled hearing gunfire echo through alleys long after midnight, turning ordinary nights into tense watch periods. Violence became routine enough that residents learned to read silence as a warning sign. At the same time, another rivalry began shaping the gang landscape even more permanently, especially as Latino crews clashed among themselves. Florencia 13 emerged as the most defining opposition for 38th Street circles moving into the 1990s. Both groups operated in neighboring zones, with Florence Firestone serving as a constant pressure point. Law enforcement later described the conflict as one of Los Angeles' longest-running gang wars. That label stuck since the hostility rarely cooled completely. The Florencia feud carried layers beyond territory disputes, blending race, prison alliances, and street economics into one complicated rivalry. Mexican mafia politics sometimes forced temporary truces between Latino groups, though resentment rarely disappeared. Former detectives later explained how prison directives could demand cooperation one year, then allow hostilities to return later. Those shifts created unstable alliances where loyalty felt conditional. Street soldiers often followed orders without understanding the bigger picture. Rumors added fuel during this period, especially stories about a supposed drug robbery that many claimed ignited racial retaliation. One version described a black gang robbing a Florencia-connected narcotics shipment, triggering cycles of revenge across multiple neighborhoods. Detectives later admitted no one ever confirmed the heist fully, though variations of the story circulated widely. That uncertainty did not slow the damage, since myth often carried more weight than verified facts. Young members repeated those tales as justification for violence. Race tensions deepened as South Central demographics shifted further during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Hispanic populations expanded across areas once dominated by African American residents, intensifying friction across shared streets. Retaliation patterns sometimes ignored gang affiliation entirely, targeting individuals based on appearance rather than membership. Prosecutors later cited cases where victims had no gang ties, yet were caught in drive-by shootings. That randomness amplified fear throughout entire communities. Several documented incidents from the 1990s highlighted how civilians paid the heaviest price during these cycles. Reports mention teenagers struck near basketball courts, bystanders wounded at bus stops, or workers caught walking home after late shifts. Pastors and local activists described neighborhoods where families kept children indoors during evenings. Some blocks experienced waves of relocation, with residents moving away whenever possible. Population shifts followed violence patterns, reshaping demographics once again. Community trauma spread quietly, since fear rarely appeared in headlines compared to dramatic crime stories. Interviews conducted years later captured parents recalling how they mapped safe walking routes for school-aged children. Business owners installed metal shutters, preparing for sudden gunfire during daylight hours. Property values dropped across certain corridors, pushing those with means to leave entirely. The social cost extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Within that climate, the reputation of 38th Street continued evolving into something larger than a local gang identity. Media coverage began grouping the name alongside broader narratives about South Central violence. Court cases referencing multi-gang feuds often mentioned the group within larger conflict frameworks. Each mention widened public perception, stretching the identity beyond one neighborhood. The name started carrying weight even among people who never set foot near Vernon. By the mid-1990s, these sustained conflicts reshaped how law enforcement and residents viewed the gang entirely. Instead of a historic clique rooted in earlier decades, it now appeared as a participant in sprawling urban conflict zones. Rivalries with Blood Sets and Florencia 13 reinforced an image tied directly to ongoing violence. Stories about mythic heists, racial wars, and endless retaliation cycles merged into one narrative. That transformation cemented a reputation that would follow the name into future decades, long after individual players changed. By the late 1990s, the game started changing in ways that went beyond shootouts or neighborhood rivalries, since money became the main driver behind street decisions. Groups tied to 38th Street circles were no longer just hustling for survival. They were building structured income streams tied to territory control. Drug distribution still played a central role, especially along corridors feeding traffic from South Central into surrounding cities. Law enforcement reports from that era started describing operations that looked less like scattered crews and more like organized enterprises. The shift was subtle at first, though it steadily reshaped how the name carried weight across Los Angeles. Street-level narcotics sales remained the foundation, yet they now worked alongside a second income source that brought steady revenue without constant risk. Extortion emerged as a major pillar, targeting businesses operating inside claimed territory. Swap meets, auto shops, small markets, street vendors, and even informal food stands began facing quiet demands for payments. Investigators later described those collections as street taxes, framed as protection fees rather than outright robbery. For many business owners, refusing meant risking vandalism, beatings, or worse. The Alameda swap meet became one of the most cited examples when authorities later broke down how these systems functioned. Located near Alameda Street and Vernon Avenue, the market drew heavy foot traffic from across Los Angeles. Vendors selling clothes, electronics, jewelry, and street food operated under constant pressure from local crews claiming control. Prosecutors would later argue that some sellers paid weekly fees simply to avoid harassment or violence. That environment turned a public marketplace into a symbol of territorial dominance. Inside correctional facilities, prison authorities tied to the Mexican mafia monitored these income streams closely, reinforcing how power flowed upward. Former gang members who later testified in court described how money collected on the streets did not stay local. Portions traveled through intermediaries who delivered funds to incarcerated leaders, maintaining loyalty across generations. That arrangement kept the taxation model alive, even when key figures sat behind bars. The structure blurred the lines between free world operations and prison governance. Messages about collections and enforcement often traveled through coded channels, including letters carried by visitors or relayed during legal calls. Investigators uncovered examples where instructions moved from prison yards into neighborhood streets within days. Those directives included payment schedules, punishment orders, and decisions about which businesses were exempt. Such coordination showed a level of organization uncommon in earlier decades. It proved the gang world had matured into something far more systematized. Enforcement of those demands rarely relied on public spectacle, since fear worked better when consequences appeared sudden and unpredictable. Some business owners reported late-night visits where masked men smashed windows without warning. Others described being followed home after refusing to pay, sending clear signals without lengthy confrontations. In more extreme cases, authorities later documented kidnappings tied to unpaid debts. Victims sometimes reappeared days later with injuries meant to serve as warnings. Witness intimidation became another key layer supporting the entire system, especially once federal attention started building in the early 2000s. Court filings from later indictments referenced instances where potential witnesses suddenly refused cooperation after threats surfaced. Some reported anonymous calls describing family routines, reminding them how closely streets were watched. Others recanted statements entirely, citing fear for children or relatives. That silence made prosecutions harder, allowing operations to continue longer than expected. Law enforcement agencies began connecting these patterns through long-term investigations, piecing together how revenue flowed across networks. Multi-year surveillance operations documented links between extortion rings and narcotics sales tied to 38th Street affiliates. Those findings painted a picture of a hybrid enterprise, mixing street muscle with organized financial systems. The evidence suggested a transition from chaotic violence toward calculated profit models. That evolution marked a turning point in how authorities approached the group. At the same time, rumors swirled across neighborhoods, blending truth with speculation about how deep those systems really ran. Some stories claimed certain blocks operated like mini corporations, with strict rules handed down from prison shot callers. Others described internal punishments for members who skimmed money before passing it upward. While not every claim could be verified, the consistency of these tales reflected widespread belief in a structured hierarchy. Street mythology started reinforcing the perception of a hidden corporate-style order. By the mid-2000s, the transformation felt complete to many observers tracking South Central crime trends. What once looked like a historic street clique, rooted in cultural identity, now resembled a revenue-driven enterprise operating across multiple layers. Drug markets, extortion networks, and prison oversight combined into a durable economic model. Each layer reinforced the others, creating stability uncommon in traditional gang structures. The name carried new meaning, tied less to neighborhood history and more to organized power. That evolution also shaped how younger members viewed their roles moving forward, especially those coming up in neighborhoods still tied to older reputations. Instead of joining loose circles built on pride alone, recruits entered systems already structured around income streams. Loyalty now connected directly to financial flows rather than just territorial identity. The streets had shifted into something colder and more calculated. By the time the 2000s closed, the groundwork for major federal attention was already firmly in place. By the late 2000s, pressure had been building quietly for years, though most people outside South Los Angeles never saw how deep the investigations were running. Federal agencies started paying closer attention as local reports showed recurring patterns tied to extortion, narcotics distribution, and prison-directed orders. Task forces were formed combining the FBI, DEA, ATF, IRS Criminal Division, and Los Angeles Police Department units. Each agency brought a different lens, whether financial tracking, weapons tracing, or organized crime analysis. That collaboration marked a shift from neighborhood policing into a full-scale federal focus. Investigators began assembling long-term cases built around enterprise theories rather than isolated crimes, aiming to prove a coordinated network existed behind street-level violence. Surveillance teams monitored phone traffic across multiple neighborhoods linked to 38th Street associates. Informants slowly emerged, some motivated by reduced sentences, others by fear of retaliation cycles. Over time, fragments of conversations started forming clearer pictures about how operations functioned. Patterns revealed coordination that stretched far beyond individual crews. Wiretaps became one of the most powerful tools during that phase, allowing agents to capture conversations tied directly to ongoing crimes. Recorded calls referenced drug shipments moving through Los Angeles corridors into surrounding counties. Some conversations hinted at planned retaliations against rivals, while others focused on collections tied to street taxes. Prosecutors later cited those recordings as key evidence, demonstrating organized command structures. Hearing members discuss operations openly gave investigators rare clarity into internal dynamics. Undercover work also expanded during those years, though agents rarely spoke publicly about those missions until court filings surfaced later. Officers posing as buyers infiltrated narcotics pipelines, documenting how transactions flowed through mid-level handlers. Others mapped extortion patterns by observing how businesses handled payment schedules. Those operations revealed layered roles inside the organization, separating street enforcers from coordinators managing money. That distinction helped prosecutors argue the presence of a structured criminal enterprise. By 2010, the accumulated evidence had grown into a massive legal blueprint, outlining how authorities viewed the entire network. Prosecutors prepared a sweeping racketeering indictment designed to capture decades of activity under one legal framework. The document stretched more than 100 pages, detailing murders, attempted killings, narcotics trafficking, extortion, and witness intimidation. It named dozens of defendants tied to different roles within the structure. That indictment aimed to show continuity rather than isolated violence. Court filings later revealed how detailed the case had become, listing specific incidents tied to both street-level crimes and prison-directed orders. Authorities described how money collected from vendors flowed upward through intermediaries into incarcerated leadership circles. Evidence included transcripts of phone calls, surveillance photos, and financial records linking defendants together. That level of documentation reflected years of groundwork rarely visible to the public. The narrative prosecutors built focused on enterprise logic rather than individual acts. When agents finally moved, they targeted multiple locations across South Los Angeles in coordinated operations designed to avoid leaks. Early morning deployments saw tactical teams serving warrants simultaneously across dozens of addresses. Helicopters hovered low, while armored vehicles blocked narrow streets near Vernon and Central corridors. Neighbors later described waking to flash bangs and loudspeaker commands echoing through familiar blocks. The scale made clear this was not a routine police sweep. Searches uncovered a wide range of evidence that prosecutors later highlighted during press conferences announcing the operation. Authorities reported seizing firearms ranging from handguns to assault-style rifles, many with altered serial numbers. Drug recoveries included methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin packaged for distribution. Cash seizures added another layer, showing profits generated from both narcotics and extortion. Those findings reinforced claims about a structured revenue model. Some of the most unsettling details surfaced in allegations involving recruitment practices tied to younger individuals. Court documents referenced instances where minors allegedly acted as lookouts or messengers within certain operations. Prosecutors argued that using juveniles helped shield older members from direct exposure. Those accusations added emotional weight to the case, drawing broader public attention. The narrative shifted from gang violence alone into questions about generational cycles. Another disturbing layer involved accusations that some members impersonated law enforcement during criminal acts. Investigators alleged instances where suspects used fake badges or uniforms to intimidate victims during robberies. Those tactics blurred the lines between authority and crime, deepening fear within targeted communities. Prosecutors framed the behavior as evidence of calculated manipulation rather than impulsive violence. The claims underscored how sophisticated certain operations had become. By the time federal officials held press briefings in early 2011, the case had already gathered national attention within law enforcement circles. U.S. attorneys described the indictment as a major strike against a long-standing criminal organization. Media coverage highlighted how the group's roots stretched back generations while still operating actively. That historical angle captured public curiosity, linking modern raids to decades-old narratives. The story carried both legal and cultural weight. For residents of South Los Angeles, the raids felt like a culmination rather than a sudden surprise, since many had sensed tension building for years. Unmarked vehicles and surveillance rumors had circulated quietly before the arrests happened. Some community members expressed relief, hoping the crackdown might ease pressure on local businesses. Others worried about power vacuums forming in the aftermath. Reactions reflected the complicated relationship between neighborhoods and long-embedded gangs. As defendants began appearing in federal courtrooms, the legal battle shifted from street operations into prolonged judicial proceedings. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the enterprise theory, while prosecutors leaned heavily on wiretaps and surveillance evidence. The case promised years of trials, plea deals, and testimonies unraveling layers of activity. That transition marked the moment when decades of street history collided with federal legal machinery. It was the peak of sustained pressure that had been building quietly for years. Even after the 2011 indictment shook neighborhoods across South Los Angeles, one reality became clear quickly, since many operations did not collapse the way outsiders expected. Investigators understood that removing street-level members would not automatically dismantle deeper structures guiding activity. Years of surveillance had already pointed toward prison-based leadership shaping decisions far beyond cell walls. That understanding pushed attention toward figures operating behind bars rather than those arrested on corners. The spotlight shifted toward the machinery, sustaining influence long after raids faded from headlines. Among the names frequently mentioned in federal filings was Danny Roman, a reputed Mexican mafia figure authorities described as wielding influence from inside California prisons. Prosecutors portrayed Roman as part of a generation that helped refine prison-run command systems, linking incarcerated leadership with street crews. Court records suggested that even without direct contact, instructions traveled through coded channels, reaching neighborhoods like those tied to 38th Street. Those directives allegedly covered collections, discipline, and alliances across multiple cities. The portrait painted by authorities showed a hierarchy extending beyond physical freedom. Within that framework, street gangs often function less like independent groups and more like subcontractors tied to a broader organization. Investigators argued that La Aimee operated as an umbrella, allowing neighborhood sets to maintain identity while answering upward when necessary. That relationship meant crews handled day-to-day operations, such as collections or enforcement, while prison leadership managed overall direction. Analysts later compared the model to decentralized networks sharing common governance. The system allowed continuity even when individual members disappeared from the streets. Extortion chains illustrated how those relationships translated into daily activity, especially within markets like the Alameda swap meet area. Money collected from vendors often passed through several hands before reaching incarcerated leaders. Former associates who later cooperated with authorities described layered delivery methods designed to avoid detection. Cash might move from collectors to trusted relatives, then toward intermediaries maintaining prison connections. Each step created distance between street crimes and the ultimate beneficiaries. Family members played a significant role in maintaining those bridges, especially when communication channels required trust beyond casual alliances. Investigators documented instances where relatives handled financial transfers or relayed coded messages during prison visits. Those intermediaries sometimes acted without direct criminal records, complicating prosecutions tied to enterprise cases. The involvement of families added emotional complexity to legal battles. It showed how deeply networks could embed themselves within community structures. Federal attention intensified further during operations later nicknamed Operation Roman Empire, which aimed to expose deeper layers of prison-controlled influence. That investigation focused on mapping connections between incarcerated figures and ongoing street activity. Authorities gathered wiretaps, financial data, and testimony linking outside crimes to inside leadership. The findings reinforced earlier theories about command structures operating beyond immediate arrests. It demonstrated how removing street actors rarely severed higher-level guidance. Court presentations tied to those operations revealed intricate communication methods designed to preserve authority despite confinement. Messages often traveled through legal mail using coded language difficult to interpret without context. Some instructions allegedly moved through visitors who memorized directives rather than carrying written notes. That approach reduced physical evidence, making investigations more challenging. Prosecutors emphasized these techniques to illustrate calculated organization rather than random coordination. Despite arrests and convictions tied to various Mexican mafia figures, many residents believed influence never truly disappeared from neighborhoods affected by earlier networks. Stories circulated about new leaders stepping into vacuums once older figures faced isolation or death. Former gang members later described how reputation alone could sustain authority even without direct communication. The belief that prison orders still mattered shaped behavior across younger generations. Perception itself became a form of power. The death of certain influential individuals over the years did alter dynamics, though it rarely erased the underlying structure entirely. Analysts studying organized crime patterns noted how systems often outlive founders through institutional memory. In this case, alliances, codes, and expectations built over decades continued guiding behavior. Younger members inherited frameworks without necessarily knowing their original architects personally. That continuity blurred the lines between past leadership and present operations. Within communities like those tied historically to 38th Street, the persistence of prison influence complicated how people interpreted crackdowns and reforms. Some residents viewed federal prosecutions as meaningful steps toward dismantling entrenched violence. Others remained skeptical, pointing to past cycles where leadership shifts failed to bring lasting change. That divide reflected decades of lived experience rather than simple opinions. It highlighted how deeply history shaped public perception. By the mid-2010s, law enforcement agencies openly acknowledged that dismantling street gangs required confronting prison-based power simultaneously. Investigators expanded strategies to monitor communication channels reaching correctional facilities. Policy discussions even touched on housing influential inmates in isolation units to disrupt networks. Those measures underscored how central prison authority remained within gang ecosystems. The fight had moved beyond neighborhoods into institutions themselves. Looking back, the role of figures like Danny Roman symbolized how influence adapted rather than vanished under pressure. Federal cases exposed structures that many suspected yet rarely saw documented clearly. At the same time, the persistence of those frameworks showed how resilient such systems could become. Arrests might remove individuals, though underlying networks often recalibrated quietly. That reality explained why crackdowns alone rarely closed chapters fully. The story of prison power running parallel to street operations added another layer to understanding how certain gangs endured across generations. It revealed a model where physical boundaries mattered less than shared codes and financial flows. For groups with roots stretching back decades, that adaptability became a survival mechanism. Even when headlines celebrated major indictments, deeper currents kept moving beneath the surface. That endurance would shape how the next chapter unfolded. After the wave of indictments settled into long court battles, the landscape across South Los Angeles did not collapse into silence the way some headlines predicted. Streets tied historically to older names continued moving with a quieter rhythm, shaped by generational turnover rather than total disappearance. Many of the defendants faced long federal sentences, leaving noticeable gaps across certain neighborhoods. Younger figures stepped forward gradually, though their style differed from earlier decades, rooted in tight hierarchies. The result felt less like an ending and more like a slow reshuffling. In the years following those prosecutions, investigators noted how smaller crews began occupying spaces once dominated by older leadership circles. These groups rarely carried the same deep institutional memory tied to earlier prison alliances. Instead, they operated through looser networks built around immediate neighborhoods and personal relationships. That shift created fragmentation, reducing large-scale coordination seen in prior eras. Yet the name itself still carried weight across streets shaped by long memories. Observers studying gang patterns described how power vacuums often encourage decentralization rather than outright collapse. Without a single dominant structure, multiple factions sometimes emerge, each claiming lineage to historic identities. In areas once tied to 38th Street influence, that pattern appeared repeatedly. Residents spoke about clusters of younger members referencing older reputations without fully replicating earlier systems. The dynamic produced a patchwork landscape of legacy and improvisation. At the same time, the idea of expansion beyond Los Angeles became more visible through reports of satellite cliques forming in other states. Law enforcement bulletins occasionally mentioned groups in places like Utah, Wisconsin, or the Pacific Northwest, referencing South Los Angeles origins. These offshoots often formed through migration patterns rather than organized campaigns. Individuals relocating for work or family carried neighborhood identities into new environments. Over time, those transplanted roots created localized versions of familiar names. While traditional street crimes persisted, investigators also began documenting shifts toward newer types of illegal activity during the 2000s. Fraud schemes involving identity theft or credit card manipulation appeared in some cases as tied loosely to former gang networks. Authorities suggested that younger members viewed digital crime as less risky compared to visible street operations. Court filings and scattered prosecutions referenced online scams linked indirectly to older affiliations. Those developments hinted at adaptation rather than stagnation. Drug trafficking did not disappear entirely, though its visibility changed compared to earlier decades, marked by open-air markets. Federal reports continued referencing importation routes, feeding narcotics into Southern California distribution chains. Some cases alleged that networks tied to older gangs still participated in broader trafficking ecosystems. Business owners in certain neighborhoods also reported ongoing extortion attempts, though patterns varied widely by location. The persistence of those claims suggested continuity beneath surface changes. Technology also reshaped how rivalries unfolded, especially as social media platforms amplified conflicts once confined to local blocks. Disputes that might have stayed within neighborhoods now spread across digital spaces visible to wider audiences. Posts referencing past feuds occasionally reignited tensions between groups carrying long histories. Law enforcement agencies began monitoring online exchanges as potential indicators of emerging conflicts. That digital layer added complexity to managing long-standing rivalries. For residents who lived through earlier decades, the modern era often felt quieter, yet still familiar in subtle ways. Murals, graffiti tags, and street memorials continued marking corners tied to older stories. Those visual reminders kept history alive, even when day-to-day violence appeared reduced. Younger generations walking past those symbols absorbed narratives passed down through families and neighborhoods. Memory itself became a bridge connecting past and present. Despite structural changes, the lingering reputation of names like 38th Street often outweighed current visibility in shaping public perception. Media references to historic cases reinforced associations between the name and earlier decades of violence or organized crime. Documentaries and online content revisiting past stories extended that legacy into new audiences. The mythology surrounding the gang sometimes traveled further than present-day realities. That gap between perception and current operations created a complicated image. Researchers studying gang evolution often point to this phase as an example of how identity can outlast centralized power. Even when large enterprises fragment, symbolic weight remains embedded in cultural memory. For groups with roots stretching back nearly a century, that endurance becomes part of their story. The narrative survives through music, oral history, and community recollection. Influence becomes as much about memory as active operations. Law enforcement strategies in recent years have reflected that understanding, focusing not only on dismantling active crimes, but also on preventing legacy recruitment. Outreach programs in South Los Angeles neighborhoods aim to steer younger residents away from inheriting older affiliations. Community organizations partner with schools to address cycles tied to historical gang presence. These efforts highlight recognition that history continues to shape present outcomes. Prevention has become as important as prosecution. Looking across the modern era, the story appears less about dramatic resurgence and more about persistence through adaptation. The structures that once dominated entire corridors have thinned, though echoes remain visible in scattered forms. Smaller crews, digital crimes, and decentralized identities reflect a landscape far removed from earlier decades. Yet the name still surfaces in investigations, reports, and community conversations. That presence suggests something that never fully disappeared. In the end, the modern chapter reflects a gang that did not simply vanish after federal pressure, but instead shifted shape across time. Generational turnover, migration, technology, and law enforcement responses all played roles in that evolution. The result is a quieter but enduring footprint, stretching across both streets and memory. Whether through reputation or residual activity, the legacy continues influencing how the name is understood today. That lingering presence sets the stage for understanding why stories like this still resonate long after the loudest chapters have passed. Looking back across nearly a century, the story starts with a small Pachuco clique rooted in factory neighborhoods, yet grows into something far more layered over time. What began around railroad yards and Vernon corridors slowly transformed into a name tied to narcotics economies, prison politics, and federal indictments. That evolution shows how identity can stretch across decades without staying fixed in one form. Each generation reshaped the meaning while still carrying echoes from the past. The result feels less like a straight line and more like a cycle repeating under different conditions. The legacy carries a dual image that remains difficult to separate even today, since some remember resistance while others remember violence. For many Mexican-American families, stories of Sleepy Lagoon still symbolize injustice tied to wartime prejudice and cultural survival. At the same time, later decades brought undeniable harm through extortion, trafficking, and neighborhood trauma. Both truths exist together, creating a complicated narrative that refuses simple labels. That tension keeps the history alive in conversations long after court cases ended. Segregation, migration waves, and incarceration cycles all shaped how the story unfolded across generations. Industrial growth packed communities tightly, while prison systems built connections that stretched influence beyond streets. Music, documentaries, and street lore later carried those memories into broader culture, spreading awareness far beyond Los Angeles. Even as traditional gang structures weakened, older names kept resurfacing through storytelling. Myth often traveled further than current reality. In the end, the deeper lesson reaches beyond one neighborhood or one group entirely. The story reflects how environments marked by pressure, inequality, and survival can produce systems that outlive individuals. Names change, faces disappear, yet patterns often remain stubbornly familiar. That is why history still matters today. It reminds us that understanding roots is the only way cycles ever truly begin to break.